What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another video in the Why Nobody Plays series. And today we're going to be taking a look at what used to be a modern staple, a deck that has changed due to bannings, and of course, the format becoming more efficient, Modern Horizons 2, and all that great happy stuff. We are going to be looking at Affinity today. This list was piloted by, I believe it's Chien's89, who took it to a 3-1 record in the Modern Preliminary on April 24th of this year. Of course, before we get too deep into it and explaining why Affinity probably sucks now, if you have not already subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing, ring the notification bell so you know when videos get posted. I post a lot of Modern and Pioneer content as well as gameplay, the occasional stream on Twitch, and of course videos like this. If you are interested in following me on Twitch, there's a link in the description to my Twitch channel. Go ahead, follow it, follow me, and go to the link in the description also for the Discord server that you can go and join. Talk about just Magic in general, a lot of Modern Pioneer, of course, just like what's posted on my channel. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at the deck and kind of talk about the history of it. I'm pulling up this list just to kind of show what it has become now. So for those that were uninitiated, Affinity way back in the day, back in original Mirrodin, played, and this deck doesn't actually play this card in here, which is actually surprising. Uh, Affinity for artifacts is based around the mechanic of your spells cost cheaper, cost one generic less for each artifact that you control. Affinity for something. So in this case, Affinity cares about artifacts. Thought Monitor, as an example, it costs 7 mana, but you can have it cost 1 blue if you have 6 artifacts, 2 if you have 5, and so on. So essentially, this deck has turned in from playing like Arcbound Ravagers and Steel Overseers and just flooding the board with Mem Knights and Ornithopters, as you can kind of see here, even from like back in the day, playing like Frogmites. They played Mirror Enforcer instead of Sojourner's Companion. Of course, Sojourner's Companion a lot cuter than Mirror Enforcer, and a little bit better just because it has artifact land cycling, which allows you to search for like your Mistvault bridges, Tangle pools, treasure vaults, and so on. Everything except Urza Saga essentially, and the random island in the deck. So it went from being these kind of like dump your hand on turn one, you play like Mox Opal, you get to play 2-drop on turn one, which was like super, super broken back in the day, and just was like infuriating because you need to have an answer right then and there for Arcbound Ravager, you needed there for Steel Overseer, so on, or else, they would play something like Crenioplating, which we do see in this deck, and they would just get to make a huge creature, Mem Knight just being able to get in there and hit your opponents for a ton of damage and make it very hard for them to kind of come back and win. For the time, like Affinity was really fully powered in modern stuff. Like Lightning Bolt was some of the best removal we had, and they had Abrupt Decay and things like that. But people were trying to play like Liliana's the Veil, which obviously isn't very good against this deck when basically all of its creatures are free, and Patchwork Automaton's probably the most amount of mana that you'd pay for a creature, realistically speaking, at 2 mana, which is kind of like a testament to like the deck. uh, Really, like it would play to the board super fast, and even like this version technically does too. It plays to the board really quick, and basically creates cranial plating that will make any of those creatures super huge, giving it +1/+0 for each artifact, and hitting your opponent, and also having the benefit of getting to attach at instant speed, so that you are able to, move it onto a creature. If you're attacking, if your opponent tries to kill the creature, like in combat, you can move it over to an unblocked creature and hit your opponent for a ton of damage. So what happened to Affinity? Well, Affinity unfortunately got hit with the Bam Hammer. We have like Mox Opal being like one of the like main and maybe even really like the only cards that like got hit in the deck. While it's definitely got a lot of like new cards to play with, in Sojourner's Companion, Thought Monitor essentially is like another Thought Cast, which is also another card that it plays just to kind of like keep you fueling and casting all these cheap creatures. Urza Saga, of course, making a lot of artifact decks very powerful. Shadow Spear being like a way that you can pump up the jams with these Sojourner's Companions, and even like get in with these Thought Monitors, Frogmites, and so on. Even put it like on a Patchwork Automaton to just absolutely ravage your opponent's board and make it very hard to create racing situations, at least on their end. being able to interact with graveyard decks. Like obviously we know that all the broken stuff that's in modern, like Affinity has acquired some of that stuff. But with a combination of, power creep in the format with, Ren and 6, Beseiju being a card that runs around pretty rampantly, with cards like Prismari Command from the 4-color creativity decks, you have, the other removal spells. You have like Leyline Binding, which is a super efficient, like, that just is a catch-all for anything that your opponent has. And one of the big things back in the day was the fact that you had a lot of creature removal. You didn't really have a lot of like permanent based removal or non-land permanent based removal. You had the abrupt decays and stuff like that. They could deal with like cranial platings and stuff, but then they also had Arcbound Ravagers and stuff, so that even if you got rid of the cranial plating, you had counters to put on Ravager, and if you got rid of the Ravager, you still had plating. And nowadays, that there is enough like catch-all removal that just making a giant creature, thanks to like Unholy Heat and Leyline Binding, and even the Prismatic Ending, makes it very hard for your opponent. And just with all the free interaction that your opponent gets to play, you getting to cheat on mana with your things is not nearly as powerful when everyone else is essentially getting to do it. And with Affinity, if you are able to stave off like the initial onslaught, like a lot of aggressive decks, you are able to kind of, turn the corner. This deck doesn't really play all that well from behind. Uh, with it only having the added benefit of probably playing a little bit better in the late game, because you could probably chain together some thought monitors, thought casts, add to the board, and kind of rebuild that way pretty quickly. But having a board full of like 2/2s, if your opponent is at a relatively high life total, just isn't very good, especially when you could just be playing cards like Murktide Region that just absolutely, destroy anything that tries to fly to the sky, on top of being backed up by like removal spells that are going to get just about any and all size of things that you could create with the Affinity deck. From a realistic standpoint, especially without having cards like Arcbound Ravager, not being able to cheat on mana, so on. Like, there's just a lot of things that negatively affect the Affinity deck. That said, of course, if you have just some crazy draws where like maybe you play a patchwork on like turn 2, dump a bunch of 0 and like 1 and 2 mana like creatures in play, you have a giant automaton, you follow it up with like, Saga going to get like a Shadow Spear, and like you could just steal games that way by making like a 4/4 or a 5/5 automaton, putting a Shadow Spear on it, making it a 6/6 trample lifelink, and just absolutely just destroying your opponent. The fact that it has Ward 2 also essentially makes like Unholy Heats cost 3, and like by the time your opponent is able to work up to an Unholy Heat to kill it, and then also have the mana available to pay for the ward, you can just kind of put them in a tough spot, just by having it grow to be bigger than the Unholy Heat. And kind of once it outgrows like an Unholy Heat, it gets pretty hard. Like, you essentially are going to need, Solitudes and things like that to get rid of it. And on top of that, of course, like Welding Jar for like all the damage based removal and stuff makes it really difficult. What I'm surprised to not see from this deck, and just kind of like as an aside from this, like the sideboard, you have some really sweet like artifacts and stuff that obviously go towards the game plan of playing these Thought Monitors, Sojourner's Companions, Frogmites, Thoughtcast, and also paying you off for like your Patchwork Automatons and stuff to give it like counters and things like that. A lot of good artifacts. I'm surprised to not see like a dress down in here. Even though it's like kind of a non-bow with like Patchwork Automaton, the rest of your creatures really don't care about it. And also the fact that like Solitude is like a way that, could really get you in these situations where like obviously a Solitude on like a Patchwork Automaton, they still have to pay 2, but of course, like, it's free. It's a little bit more manageable to pay 2 mana like on turn 2 to get rid of Patchwork than like to pay like 3 mana on turn 3 to deal with a Patchwork, especially if you're on the draw. For the fact that, there is a possibility that your opponent could just chain together Thought Monitors, Thought Casts, so on, and eventually just put enough counters on Patchwork where it just outgrows a lot of the damage based removal, forces you to have the Solitude, and by then, like, the work is already done for Patchwork. They've flooded the board. They have a huge creature. You dealt with a huge creature. Now you're dealing with a bunch of 1/1s and 2/2s that have the possibility of just getting pumped up by cranial plating, Shadow Spear, and so on. So while there is definitely some nice things about this deck, like Affinity, It definitely doesn't see a lot of play. Even though it's probably one of the better budget options in the format, it can definitely be very powerful. You can definitely make plays with it. I don't know if it's necessarily like winning a tournament, but definitely if you are not prepared for Affinity, you could just absolutely get hosed by it. That said, in terms of playing at like a high competitive level, you definitely want to be playing something a little bit more consistent. Affinity is definitely like boom bust. It is a deck that if you do not win game one, you are very unlikely not to win game two and game three, just because there is so much in general like a main deck hate, and some of the sideboard hate incidentally goes after Affinity as well. So while it would be fun playing it a few times to just kind of like dump your hand on like turn two or turn three, and from there like top deck or like even just kill your opponent with like a Shadow Spirit Sojourner's Companion. This deck is not very optimal if you are looking to grind like RCQs period, maybe like Moto leagues and stuff like that. Definitely not a deck that I would recommend playing, but kind of interesting to see the metamorphosis of this Affinity deck. As I alluded to in the beginning, you had like Arcbound Ravagers, you had Cranial Platings, you had just these different like Affinity creatures, and then like it's morphed into playing like Masters of Theriums and Etch Champions, these 3 drops that are pretty powerful and kind of make your other artifacts like really powerful. And on top of that, too, Etch Champion wears like a cranial plating very well because it has like protection from all colors if you have Metalcraft, and of course, most of the creatures being played in the format, unless you were also playing Affinity, it basically had protection from those things. It had protection from all the removal and stuff like that that you could be playing in the format. So then it just got to like run rampant unless you could get rid of enough artifacts to actually deal with it. So that is why nobody plays Affinity. Kind of unfortunate because this deck was a staple of the modern format. I mean, it was, super popular. It was probably one of the best game one decks that you could play in the format for the fact that, you punished mulligans, you punished hands that were relatively weak, even if your opponent didn't mulligan. And even some decks could have some like pretty reasonable draws, and then just lose out of nowhere to the deck because of some of the resilient threats that the format didn't yet have answers to. So really unfortunate from like a historical standpoint because for a lot of people like they're very nostalgic about Affinity. Affinity is very much like a mechanic that kind of like terrorized like Type 2 or Standard back in the day when it was released in original Mirrodin, and run rampant through modern really well up into the mid 2010s, and I would say probably even pretty late too, as I believe that it made the finals of one of the Mythic Championships. When we kind of went from Pro Tours to Mythic Championships, now back to Pro Tours and stuff. We don't like to get into it, but um, pretty pretty sweet stuff. Pretty cool that like Affinity is still, I would say at least, probably at best like respectable and probably like an okay choice, but by and large, if you're trying to, I would say win anything substantial, I think you'd have to play a pretty decent amount of games with like Affinity, with no real like possibility of it being like super broken tier one, so on. So that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like on the video, and of course consider subscribing to the channel and ring the notification bell so you can get videos like this. You can get Modern Pioneer videos, and of course there's 2 links in the description of this video. Follow them to Twitch, throw me a follow on Twitch so you know when I go live, and uh, go to the Discord server as well, just so we can talk about Magic and stuff like that. And maybe you can tell me why I'm wrong that Affinity is actually uber busted in like the modern format. So let me know. That being said, that's gonna do it for me. I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope to see you all in the next video.